And now. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sitting today with Dr. Sari Arho Havrén. She is a counselor and senior advisor at Business Finland. She leads the Team Finland foresight and strategy work in Europe. She has worked and she was based in Asia Pacific for over a decade, working in Hong Kong, Beijing, Bangkok, and Shanghai. She's an avid China watcher. She's also a Futures Fellow at Mercator Institute for China Studies in Germany and a visiting researcher at University of Helsinki. Sari, thank you first of all for being with us today. Thanks for your time. As I said, you're talking to us from Brussels. You've recently relocated from Hong Kong, and it's something I'd like to get out of the way first before we start diving in EU-China relations issues and new alliances worldwide. I'd like to talk about Hong Kong because, you've come back even more recently than me from that place. What is your prognosis for the future of Hong Kong? I mean, you've gone through the umbrella movement, you've gone through the anti-extradition law protests, you've seen the new security legislation creeping up and being put in force. So, what's your prognosis for Hong
Kong? Well, it's not very bright in terms of human rights or individual freedoms. So I left Hong Kong 4 days before the national security law came to force, and that was not related to that. But yes, I witnessed it, and I was surprised, a little bit surprised how quickly it was imposed, and the whole process, how quickly it went through. And with the current regime, I think the future of Hong Kong is going to the direction where the democratic freedoms that Hong Kongers once enjoyed are further diminishing. And I'm not only referring, of course, to democracy as elections, because that has been a debatable point anyway. But of course, it's much more than that. For instance, the independent institutions and other freedoms. And from Beijing's point of view, Hong Kong cannot afford having them anymore. So these are the domains where there is a threat to the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So freedom of speech, political freedoms, and dissident opinions have become a threat to Beijing. And Beijing fears political subversion from outside actors, more than anything else. And if we think about Hong Kong, so what is a more vulnerable place for such activities as a starting point or trigger than Hong Kong in Beijing's eyes? So therefore, Beijing is doing everything not to allow any such seeds to grow in Hong Kong. And in reality, we have already witnessed the snitch hotlines to report and denounce your neighbors in breaking the national security law. And this is incredible that in Hong Kong, neighbors start spying on each other. It's something that you could have never imagined even a year ago, or let alone 2 years ago. But of course, then I have to add that we have this alternative reality on the side, and that is the financial markets. And these seems like two realities that have almost nothing to do with each other. And that's also quite significant, and as an observer, it's astonishing. So China still, of course, has extensive capital controls in place and often interferes in its financial markets and banking system. And Hong Kong is still one of the most free economies in the world, and one of the biggest markets for equity and debt financing. So my view is that the rule of law will continue to be at place to protect businesses and markets, but not individuals when it comes to the space that it could be a threat to Beijing.
I see. Sari, you've looked a lot in your career at innovation, especially through your work at Business Finland. How do you see this having an impact on innovation in Hong Kong? I mean, we are seeing a lot of competition in other places in Asia, and obviously a lot of people are thinking about Singapore in that regard. Do you see these shifts in the political scene, the political atmosphere in terms of freedom of speech? Do you see this having an impact on the power of innovation in Hong Kong, if there was any power of innovation at all?
Well, this has always been a challenge for Hong Kong because the lack of talent and the cost of talent in Hong Kong. And it's a small market. Although the quality and level of universities is very high in Hong Kong. And now the innovation domain looks towards Greater Bay Area. The integration is there, and it was never an integration of the China side of the Greater Bay Area to Hong Kong, but I think it was always the other way around, to integrate Hong Kong to Guangdong. And I think the innovation capacity probably that Hong Kong is going to witness comes from this integration. But at the same time, we have the big drivers, big trends where the technological space in the world is continuing dividing between China-led world and then the free world and the other world. We are witnessing the supply chain diversification, all these trends that are driving us towards two entities. And I don't think Biden will reverse this trend. So Hong Kong, in fact, is a very small piece in this puzzle. And I think it will be more and more looked into the domain of China's innovation overall.
Okay, so overall prognosis, not totally negative, but life support, definitely.
Yes.
Life support.
And of course, probably Hong Kong might play a role in China's bigger plans for in their innovation plans. China will probably give some sort of a role again for Hong Kong.
Sure. Okay. Let's move on to the bigger parts of what I wanted to discuss with you today. As I said earlier, you moved back to Brussels recently, and actually you moved back just in time to see at the end of August the 5-country tour by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. You've also witnessed probably firsthand the virtual summit that happened a couple of weeks earlier. All those didn't go down really well. I mean, we cannot really say that those were really successful events for the EU-China relationship. How do you see the relationship evolving? I mean, we're starting from a position when there seems to be a lot of infighting within Europe. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of capacity to build like a front, a common front against China. Germany is obviously one big question mark. What is Germany trying to do in this regard? So what's your take on this, and how do you see the relationship evolve?
Well, yeah, you're right. Well, first of all, I think the tide in Europe is clearly turning. So countries across Europe are becoming increasingly skeptical of Beijing's intentions. We here share the kind of a disappointment of, and especially the Eastern European nations, not getting the investments they were expecting. And there is a widespread unease, I would say. And then we have, of course, this strengthening talk of reducing the dependency on China and of strategic European sovereignty and autonomy, industrial sovereignty. And I think at the same time, Europe is slowly awakening to the fact that EU is not adequately equipped to tackle the challenges that are posed by a country that is state-led, it's authoritarian, and it's a state capitalist economy. How can our companies really compete with the Chinese companies that are subsidized heavily, that are state-led strategically? And while we are still very much looking forward the multilateralism to return, open markets, and at the same time we are talking about this sovereignty, and these are a little bit paradoxical and even controversial in a way. And of course, lots of this is now, first we talk about industrial sovereignty and autonomy and all this in Europe. And then now we are looking at the Biden that he will come and establish the multilateralism again, free markets and all that, which have been, of course, very important for Europe. So I'm not sure that the European policymakers and politicians quite also understand the big picture of what does it mean, the state-led actor like China with united front and all the repertoire that they are using, state-led hybrid influencing, cyber attack, false and fake news, repeating Beijing-friendly narratives, and new type of technology led influencing together with the traditional ones. So it's not just the economic and trade issues, but it's a very big and complex entity to tackle with. And at the same time, like you mentioned, Germany, the member states' economic relations with China are very diverse. So and Germany especially. So I think we are a little bit in a moment right now, like waiting what is going to happen with Biden, with the transatlantic relations, and but China is marching onwards in the meantime.
Do you think the Biden administration will change anything to this picture? From a European standpoint?
I don't really think, at least not very quickly, because the US is very occupied in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific area, and in addition to that, Biden is said to be moving quite cautiously, and even that he's experienced in foreign policy, but he has also been criticized that his foreign policy views perhaps are not always thoroughly, what words should I use, realistic, or at least they were overthrown by Obama in a couple of points. So as I said, now that we are talking about the strategic autonomy or sovereignty, and we are spending time in debating what these words mean, then at the same time, now we are having a lot of expectations from Biden, and I don't think that he's quite going to deliver, at least not very soon. So, as I said, I see the paradox between our expectations and what we want, and we are not even unified in what we are really expecting.
Absolutely. Let's go back to Germany, because that's exactly, I think, what I understand from what you just said. We are not exactly sure what we want in Europe, and we obviously don't all want the same thing. Germany, and I'm going to quote the head of Merix, the think tank that you've joined recently. He himself, if I remember correctly, tweeted that the weak link in Europe is Germany. Within Germany, it's the automobile industry, and within the auto industry, it's Volkswagen. I think this is a good summary of the major issue we have when it comes to facing China and Chinese ambitions, which is why I also think that from a European standpoint, Biden administration, Trump administration doesn't really change much for us. Obviously, the package will be different. Biden will not tweet like Trump was tweeting, but at least Trump called a spade a spade.
Yes.
I'm not so sure that the Biden administration will be that bold, which sometimes can gain a lot of time for everybody. But going back to Germany, Germany seems to be in a position when it comes to China, and we have the same problem with the way they are refusing to support France when it comes to confronting Turkey, for example. They seem to be in this position where their interests are absolutely not aligned with the rest of European members. economic interest, political interest, the pressures they have. I mean, with Turkey, with Erdogan, it's obviously the large Turkish immigrant population, which makes Angela Merkel very wary of angering Mr. Erdogan. But in terms of the economy, how can we have a common say in when it comes to human rights violations, for example, when you see that Volkswagen is quite heavily involved in Xinjiang? How can we have a common ground when it comes to Chinese attempts at purchasing strategic assets in Europe, when you see the very different legislation throughout Europe? And when you look at the dependency that Germany has with the Chinese economy, when you look at the market shares that Volkswagen have, going back to Volkswagen, shouldn't we just wait, instead of waiting for a new US administration, shouldn't we just wait and hope for a new German administration?
Well, we will have that next year, right? so
Anxiously looking for that.
Yeah, but like I said, at the same time, China is marching onwards, and I think we will have a couple of quite scary months ahead, actually, right now. But yeah, you're actually absolutely right. So, like I said, this paradox there that we are waiting the US somehow to be tougher, and we could be tougher together. That's what everybody now is saying, that we can have this united front against China and we would be tougher together. But I'm not sure Europe has really thought of what does it mean being tougher. So why would we now be tougher somehow together with the with the US, because there's a stronger transatlantic alliance maybe coming up? So have we thought about how are we going to contribute? And as you said, there are very different opinions, very different views within the EU nations. And we have a very good example of Australia right now that is struggling with its relationship with China and have been punished, especially with the trade relations. So have we somehow been there for Australia, supporting Australia? No, we have not. And I think this is a great example of like in free and open trade environment, we let our industries operate as they see fit. We are not even equipped to regulate them. Well, of course, by legislation we would be, but it will take time. And I don't think there is really a will, because we still are calling for multilateralism and open free markets. So I think there's a lot of naivety and wishful thinking here.
Absolutely.
And not really a common view. How are we going to be tougher on China together with the US? Absolutely.
The new European legislations on investment control, foreign investment control, we've gone from a situation where clearly the legislation EU-wide had no teeth, basically. It kept most of European countries as some of the widest open to anyone who wanted to come in and take over strategic assets. There seems to have been some realization in Brussels that this particular thing needs to be addressed, and there seems to have been a strengthening of this legislation. How do you see that? You see this as enough? Do you see this as going in the right direction, or are we still stuck in this wishful thinking, considering that there is absolutely no reciprocity whatsoever in terms of what the Chinese can do in Europe, or the Americans for that matter, and what we can do over there?
Well, I was hoping you would bring this up, because this is certainly, there are concrete steps towards this direction. And these are part of the European sovereignty, the autonomy discussion, industrial sovereignty discussion. So there are concrete steps that the Union is taking within the limits that they can. So we are slowly moving towards that direction, but of course the pace is very slow. And at the same time, the public opinion has changed tremendously during the pandemic against China, and I would assume that this will also affect the politicians. in Europe when the public sentiment is so negative. And another thing is always that, of course, we don't always need a legislation. For instance, the port in Italy, the Trieste port, where the negotiations with the Chinese party, state-led company, were already quite, I think they were quite far. But in the end, the investor came from Germany. So it doesn't always mean that you need a legislation. It also can be that the sentiment plays a big role there.
And there's also, I was talking recently to a China observer based in Serbia, and he was telling me that this over there in the Balkans, there seems to be a realization as well that there is no way these countries can afford to rely solely on Chinese investments. And there seems to be a realization in Europe that this needs to be addressed, that this is basically a weak point in the European fortress, and that they're putting out now this multi-billion euro program to help basically infrastructure development in those areas. So indeed, there seems to be a realization that something needs to be done. The question is, how are the Chinese advanced in their influence strategy? And is it possible for us Europeans to undo this now?
Yes, it's possible to undo, and I think China has advanced very well in getting its narrative through Europe. So I think we have a kind of a view that China has done more than it's in many places has done, while the EU is not very good in actually promoting what EU does all the time.
Absolutely.
And they also woke up with this realization during the pandemic, when China was drumming how much aid they are giving, and it was actually trade, not aid. And the EU was doing much more for the member states financially, and funding them and aiding them. And nobody knew this, and I'm not sure they still know. So China is very successful in drumming its narrative across the globe, not just in Europe. And this is a quite scary thing, that we can be influenced so well. But then, of course, China eventually played over her hand in especially with the pandemic in Europe.
Absolutely. I think this is taking us to the question of alliances. We've talked about a new Biden administration, whether it is going to change anything for us here in Europe, but also for an Indo-Pacific strategy, both European and American. There seems to be a reorganization of alliances worldwide. The world seems clearly to be falling into the anti-China, or maybe not pro-China, but at least China-neutral camp. Quad is being reaffirmed. I mean, you've mentioned Australia. We see a reaffirmation of the Quad Security Alliance in the Pacific. As you said, Central European countries are starting to resist Chinese influence. We've all seen what's been going on between the Czech Republic and mainland China and Taiwan. Turkey is becoming a serious problem, a serious thorn in the thigh of NATO, both with this whole Macron affair, but also their involvement in the war by Azerbaijan against Armenia. We have the Iran-China 25-year cooperation agreement. All those developments seem to paint a picture of new alliances and possibly stronger alliances. What's your take on this? And how do you see this evolving? You see this changing the picture fundamentally, or is it just a reaffirmation of something that was in progress a long time ago?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and you are right that the global political landscape has become, first of all, incredibly challenging, and we see a lot of formation of new kind of alliances. And one thing, of course, is the democracies hoping to work closer together now with the Biden administration. But what comes to China, I think with China, these alliances are more on a bilateral basis. So of course we all know about the relationship with the strengthened relationship with Russia. Some people or some analysts say that this is a real alliance, and while others are a bit more skeptical about it. And we know that in Moscow there are a lot of voices who are quite wary about whether to trust China and whether China is using Russia to its own purposes. And I think even in alliances, nations are traditionally using the alliances for their own purposes, obviously. But I think these axes that you mentioned about where China is involved, I think they are very much China-led, based on bilateral relations. And there are some interesting arguments about this, China establishing a new tribute system with countries, and Australia again being a good example of it, that if Australia wants to reaffirm the relationship with Australia have a list of what they should do, just given by Beijing. So I think this axis is pretty much China-led, bilateral relations, which China prefers. Traditionally, China doesn't prefer European or US type of alliances. And like you mentioned, also China has tied up countries via Belt and Road, and this is usually by economic means. And these countries then follow China's lead for instance, when they vote in the international organizations.
Like we've seen with Pakistan recently.
Yes, and we can see, of course, in Asia that there's Pakistan and Cambodia that are very much China dependent. But whether it's an alliance or dependencies is another question. But I think in the context of global power politics, we have this concept of counterbalancing. And this is something that we are going to witness. What you said is we have the anti-China countries and then those who are China neutral, or I would say China dependent, more or less. So I think this counterbalancing will go on, and this is typical in the great power politics when we have two superpowers, and if either of them gives in, it's actually given into the giving an opportunity to the other one. So it's very difficult to see actually that this kind of a again engagement somehow could take place, or it means that the other one becomes in a weaker position. But then we have, of course, this so-called bandwagoning countries that are usually smaller ones, and that is the thing in Europe with many countries, even to some extent Germany, like you mentioned earlier on. So the alliances are not maybe as clear as they have been some decade ago. But indeed, this moment of time that we are living, we are witnessing certainly new type of agreements, new type of dependencies and alliances.
True. It's true that it seems that a lot of countries are still up for grabs in terms of influence. I've looked a lot at Latin America, and the relative absence of Uncle Sam in Latin America, especially in terms of infrastructure development, has made it very easy for China to penetrate with virtually no resistance. We've all seen what China has been doing in Africa. But at the same time, we've also seen proofs of the limitations of the Chinese model. There seems to be realization that the Chinese are trying to reboot BRI or trying to redeploy it in a different way. Do you think, as a China watcher, and you've lived in Beijing as well, and Shanghai, do you think China learns from their mistakes?
Yes, eventually I think they will learn from their mistakes. But But at the same time, the world view that the Chinese Communist Party has and has to have to maintain their power, and it's first of all to secure their power at home. So there's the talk of sovereignty, nationalism in China. So they have to secure the power base at home. And then the other things what they are doing internationally is actually securing the power base at home, to keeping the Communist Party in power. So I think this already kind of creates limitations of what China can do and cannot do, and how much it can allow the open criticism towards China and all these areas where China has been pushing back a lot, quite aggressively. Maybe they can tone down this kind of wolf warrior behavior, but in the end, behind it all, I don't think there is so much leeway to change the behavior. At the same time, China lacks the kind of a soft power that the US has, which comes from the culture, and it's not like spreading fake news or narratives or propaganda. That's not really soft power, and I think it's a bit misunderstood in Beijing what it is really.
True.
So there are tremendous limitations for Beijing to actually reach their goals. But at the same time, they are very powerful militarily already, economically, of course, and so we will certainly see this counterbalancing continue.
Okay. Sari, I'd like to close this discussion with a question about a country that we haven't talked much about, but as a Finn, you've certainly looked at it very closely, if only for historical reasons. The role of Russia in this whole China affair. I'm French. We in France, and it seems to be shared by quite a few, I would say, Western European countries, we share the view that somehow the US is forcing us into a confrontation with Russia that is not necessary, that is not necessarily natural for us. I do understand that Scandinavian countries have a very different take, especially Finland, because of history. I grew up in Czechoslovakia, and I've had the same echo from countries in Central Europe for obvious historical reasons. But if we try to put our own histories aside and our own feelings aside, do you see a real alliance between China and Russia? Do you see a real need for us to put Russia on that side of the fence? And isn't there any way we can leverage what I would call the harshly realistic approach that Vladimir Putin has in all world affairs? This guy, at least from my point of view, doesn't seem to be an ideologist. He seems to be brutally realistic. Isn't there a way we can deal with that, which could be actually easier than dealing with a much more ideologistic China?
That's a tricky question and a difficult one. I lived in the Soviet Union myself when I was very young, I'd say that, but this is very much my personal opinion, not a scholarly opinion, really. I'd say that Russia has more tendency or willingness to lean towards Europe than towards Asia. Culturally, I think Russia has more ties with with Europe than with Asia. I think there is a deep-rooted distrust towards China. And I agree. I think, of course, the global political situation has driven these two countries to form the strategic alliance that they have right now. And I just read one analysis, I can't remember where it was mentioned, in some US sources, that there is pondering about how to break this alliance between Russia and China. But the reference was made towards the time how US then eventually started to play on China and established the diplomatic relations and broke the eventual threat of China and Russia turning closer together. So in a way, yes, I agree that but at the same time, of course, we should then ignore the clear violations what Russia has done with Crimea, with Ukraine, and all this space. So it's a very difficult domain.
So that would take us to become, like Putin, brutally realistic.
Yes, and we have already given a lot away, our values as it is. So it wouldn't, in this respect, be anything different, maybe.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Sari, for these very interesting angles, these very interesting opinions that you shared with us. I will be, on behalf of Asia Power Watch, doing more of these interviews, these one-on-one interviews, and I would like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.